Well, maybe a way to start this off is there's this piece by Josh Marshall, and it looks like we're zeroing in on what's going to eventually be the bill, and it's probably be something like half the 3.5 trillion that was, I guess agreed or not half agreed upon, some sort of Schrodinger-like agreement. But Josh Marshall had a section here, David, and I'll put this up. This paragraph here, which I think really encapsulates what's the frustration people have with the Democratic Party. And Josh writes this. I confess that I have completely given up on making sense of what is going on the Capitol. So, I mean, people should maybe stop reading Josh. But is there going to be a reconciliation bill? Is the BIF going to pass? I have no idea. I'm going to skip a little bit forward. That is, to put it mildly, deeply unfortunate because the public is drifting away from the president and his party in significant part because they cannot seem to act on an agenda they say is so important. They are also sowing a creeping disillusionment and demoralization among their own partisans. This is fundamentally the fault of Democratic voters who missed the chance to elect 2 or 4 more senators last November. But the problem is Joe Biden's to solve. So there's a little stop to the end at, okay, I guess the buck stop does there, but if only the fucking voters pulled their finger out and saved us from this.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you lose Josh Marshall, you've kind of lost the most hardcore partisan base of your party. I mean, Josh Marshall's been a pretty fierce cheerleader for Biden and the kind of more establishment wing of the Democratic Party for a while. So the fact that even he is saying stuff that I think people on the left have been saying for some time now, I think just shows you how, I think we can give up all pretenses to, there being a kind of 12th dimensional chess being played here, there being some sort of wider strategy. It's, it is exactly the kind of floundering failure that it appears to be.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when looking back in hindsight, what Joe Biden sort of ended up representing was he was just like, I don't know. It wasn't like a glorious embodiment, but he was the embodiment of the Democratic Party. He was just sort of like the neutral option for people who are in that machine to show up for at the end of the day, which I think is why a lot of people on the left sort of had a difficult time understanding and sort of seeing him coming to power. I mean, Michael Brooks was very prescient on that early on, was saying when people were sort of writing Joe Biden off, Michael was always saying that Joe Biden was the biggest threat to Bernie. But before we focus too much on this year and the year before, I was wondering if you could sort of give us a kind of brief history of Joe Biden. Like, where does he sort of come from within the Democratic Party movement? What was his record as a senator? I mean, we don't have time to go through everything, but just sort of give people an understanding because he's been around for a very long time.
Yeah, one of the longest serving senators in U.S. history. I'll revive the stump speech that I gave for the first few months of 2020, which was that Biden came out of a kind of precarious middle-class family that at times was doing really well. At other times, his dad fell in hard times for a variety of reasons. I think that partly shaped his worldview. He obviously grew up in Delaware, heavily segregated state with a lot of a history of racism, and by the time that he was really coming into his political career, those tensions around race and racial divisions were really coming to a head. He was initially a Newcastle County council member. His big selling point was that he was young, charming, good looking, all of that stuff, kind of superficial things. When he ran for the Senate, he ran against a very old and elder statesman of Delaware politics, and no one expected that he would win. I think, ran as a way to kind of raise his profile, but because he was so young, because he had this, politician's charisma, he was able to get people on board and get people excited for his run. And he raised a lot of small dollars. He ran on a kind of sort of wishy-washy anti-Vietnam platform. First, he kind of just didn't take a very firm stance one way or another. Then as time went on, he kind of went more into the firmly pro-withdrawal camp. And most interestingly, I think for the way that we think of Joe Biden now and the way that his career went, he ran on this kind of New Deal-ish platform that was almost, you look at kind of what Bernie Sanders was saying in 2020 and 2016, and what Biden was saying then wasn't that dissimilar. He was talking about starting a consumer protection agency. He was talking about the billionaire, not so much the billionaires, but the millionaires and big business and all the $1 billion corporations and how they were dodging taxes and all this kind of thing. Ran on actually a fairly progressive campaign. He won. And for the first few years, he kind of stuck to that messaging. And then, as wider political conditions in the United States really shifted, so you saw things in Delaware really get crazy around the issue of busing. Biden, who until then he had said anti-busing things, but he had always voted the liberal line on busing. Now, to save his political skin, he sees that politics is changing. He becomes, the most fervent anti-busing politician, maybe in the country. I mean, outside of the South at least. And he starts also talking about the need to cut spending. That becomes a big thing because inflation is rising. That the narrative becomes that the reason inflation is out of control is because of all these crazy government programs. He actually puts forward a bill, what he calls a sunset bill, which basically provides for, I think, every 5 years, every single federal program has to be reauthorized by Congress. It's an insane, extreme bill that was called as such at the time, but that's the kind of way he's going forward. By the 80s, he really transitions to the Reagan style of politics, because that's where politics is heading as a whole. And he really, for the next, 4 decades, 3 decades, really until now, kind of becomes one of the main conservative anchors of the Democrats, always pushing them to go right, always pushing them in a more Reaganite direction on foreign policy, on domestic spending, on entitlement programs, and so on and so forth. And, that's ultimately why, part of the reason why he was chosen by Obama to be vice president, because part of the idea was, people are worried I'm a young black guy, I'm kind of liberal, well, therefore I'll pick this conservative dinosaur from Delaware to assuage the kind of more conservative elements of the voting public. And then, of course, Biden becomes vice president, and really just being off being vice president, off being kind of Obama's most visible friend and ally for 8 years, really gives him this affection, I think, among some core sections of the Democratic Party voting, different segments of it. And that really, I think, is what made him such a threat to Sanders, even though I think, we could all agree that Biden was not quite the man he was through most of his career. When he ran in 2019, 2020, people had a lot of affection for him because they thought of him as, this is Obama's guy, this is Obama's best friend, and we love Obama. And there you have it. That's where we are now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting looking at, I guess, now, like the early days of the Biden administration, is seeing his ability maybe to see which way the wind's blowing, and at least see where there's appetite within the party. Maybe not necessarily for action, but for reference. Matt and I have been calling him the press release president, because he's been very good at, sort of really, pivot, not pivoting in policy to the left, but sort of in rhetoric at times, in a way that is quells, I don't know, the more progressive base of the Democratic Party. Well, when it comes to delivering, not really, showing up. And before we get into the most current chapter, I was just curious, do you think, because we see within Biden's history that he has had all of these, significant shifts, right, from his earliest days to his sort of, the vast majority of his career when he's sort of a Reagan Democrat, to this kind of, being sort of tied up with the Obama wing of the Democratic Party. Do you think that there is sort of a deep ideological core to Bidenism, or do you think that he's an opportunist at this point?
I think he's very opportunistic. I think there is some ideological core to him. I mean, he I didn't quite buy all this stuff that people were saying through 2020, where they're saying, well, he just goes wherever the wind blows. I mean, I don't think that's completely true. He has always been and always sold himself as a more conservative Democrat. It is true that he has shifted with the times, as I think most politicians do. I mean, even Trump signed an eviction ban and reauthorized it, which is incredibly radical compared to previous presidents. But that doesn't mean that Trump is necessarily some sort of FDR 2.0. He did what he felt like he had to do to win an election and to keep his approval ratings high. So I think it's a similar thing with Biden. I think he is an opportunist, as most politicians are. He's not unique in that. I think that where his ideological core is, if we can sort of define some sort of Bidenism, is this idea of the middle class. I mean, that is obviously shaped, I think, by his childhood, where he came out of. And I think it's also shaped by the political kind of era that he came out of, where, a lot of the time when he talks about the middle class, and especially in the 70s and the 80s, he was talking about a very specific thing. He was talking about a very specific version of the middle class. He meant kind of white suburbanite voters, the kinds of people that ended up going Reagan's way. And the thing that he used to tell people in the 80s was, you don't want to sacrifice the middle class on the altar of all these different special interests, by which special interests he means, he meant Black people and Latinos and poor people and LGBTQ people and all those different kinds of demographics. And so, I think this kind of idea of trying to anchor policies in the sense of what are they going to do for the middle class, as I guess how I would describe Bidenism. I think he has also that kind of what we might call kind of blue collar or working class kind of identity politics, where he sort of adopts he'll say certain things, or he'll adopt certain kind of cultural characteristics that we might associate with kind of blue collar white workers, and kind of take that on as a way to identify with people. That the Amtrak thing, of course, famously rode a train to and fro. I think that was really key to his persona for a long time. Made himself kind of an everyman, and of course, he always bragged about, I'm the poorest guy in the Senate. I never made any sort of money, which is kind of true to an extent. I think it's a little.
Well, Obama famously loaned him some money when he was VP, right? And they made a big deal about that.
Yeah, because his son was in hospital and he was racking up medical bills. Ironically, one of the tragedies of that is the reason his son probably got the brain tumor that he did was because he was in Iraq, which of course is a war that Biden worked very hard to make possible. That sort of tends to get elided from his biography a little bit, that he really paved the way for the war that ended up creating his son's fatal disease. But I think that, to the point that to the extent that we can narrow down some sort of Bidenism, that's how I would describe it. And I think the Biden right now that we're seeing is very different to the Biden of the last 40, 50 years. It's a better Biden, but I think we're learning that in this era, a better Biden is not really enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I just was reminded of the Kamala Harris exchange in the debates where she brought up the busing issue to hit him on and to sell merchandise on. But then after it developed for a few days, she didn't actually have anything structural to provide in this. And we've always been saying, look at what he does on the structural things, like the minimum wage or the PRO Act or healthcare expansion, like this sort of stuff. And he's basically came up lame in all those attempts so far. Voting rights, another one. They're just not on the table. And I feel like just that says a lot about where this Democratic Party is now. It's a point where it can elaborate like the fight against fascism or the saving democracy, but not even remotely, because they're afraid of, like you're saying, the middle class, I guess older middle class, I would think. I don't know. How do you explain that disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's kind of the classic Democratic thing, which is especially over the last 4 years, you use kind of maximalist rhetoric, and you say all this stuff, but you don't really believe it. You know that the people that you're selling it to believe it,
Mhm.
And so you are trying to sound like them because you want them to vote for you. But in the end, do they really think democracy was at stake? I mean, if they really believed, if Biden really believed that this was kind of U.S. democracy's last gasp right now, why would the argument be, well, we can't get rid of the filibuster because we need it in case the Republicans take power? Well, you've been saying that there is no next time. That there, the Republicans, when they take power, that'll be it. That'll be the end of democracy. So holding something in your back pocket like that is completely pointless. I would maybe add one thing, actually. What you were saying about how a lot of the structural stuff hasn't really changed that much. Maybe one thing that we could say is a core of Bidenism, to the extent that it exists, is that certainly the way he pitched himself in this campaign, and he sort of said things like this previously, where the idea is it's this class warfare stuff is wrong. He said this in the 2000s. He gave this interview, I think in 2003, and he said this whole thing that people are saying that you need to do class warfare and stuff, that's a terrible idea. What Clinton did in the 90s, that's where the country is. That's where you need to go. You don't need all this ridiculous populism stuff. And in 2017, as he was kind of gearing up for a run, he did that famous speech to that hedge fund conference where he basically said to a bunch of Wall Street finance people, I need you. I need your help. Nothing will fundamentally change. That's where that famous line comes from. He told them nothing's going to change, but if we can just sort of tinker around and find the right balance where you don't have to sacrifice all that much, and we give just enough to certain groups, and we fix things, and we educate people enough, and the workforce gets back to where it is, then everything will be fine, and we can basically just keep going as we've been going. And that's kind of what he's tried to do as president. Conspicuously, a lot of the things that he and the party have kind of given up on are the things that really were probably most threatening to donors, to big business, which of course gave very handsomely to Biden's campaign, has been lobbying very hard, through his whole year. Things like the $15 minimum wage, things like the public option, which has just completely disappeared. Doesn't even, no one even mentions it anymore. So it's all, things like childcare and universal pre-K, they are very good, but those are things that in common benefit both working people and also businesses. That is also very, very helpful for businesses. So he's tried to do that. I mean, it hasn't really worked out so far. So I guess we're seeing the fruits of that approach.